I'm Denis and I'm coming up to 71 years of age now. Lived in Scarborough almost all my life, apart from a period when I was in the Merchant Navy. And, or a short period towards the end of the war when we moved away from Scarborough. My father was killed during the war. He was on a trawler in the Hebrides. Maybe that's the attraction why I visit there every summer. And his trawler was sunk by a German submarine, which became one of the so-called atrocities of the Second World War. It was used in the war crimes trials in Nuremberg in Germany. One of the examples they used against Admiral Raeder and Admiral Denis. Yes, my father fished all his life up to the age of 31 when he was killed. I was only 6 at the time. And shortly after that, my mother, being not a Scarborough woman, she was from Hartlepool, we moved away because she had friends in Sheffield. Wasn't a very good place to go to in 1944-45 because there was still bombing there. And we only stayed there a year and came back to Scarborough again. So apart from that and 9-10 years I was in the Merchant Navy, I've lived here all my life. I did the 10 years. I went to sea at the age of 16. A lot of my friends went in the Royal Navy, but I preferred to try for the Merchant Navy because my family had been in. 2 brothers were in the Merchant Navy. One during the war. He was on the Atlantic convoys during the war and settled in Canada. He died several years ago, but he raised a family there and we're still in touch with them. And I'm into genealogy, as I mentioned, and tracing back through the years, I found that my family originated from Lowestoft in Suffolk. You always think your family have always been there, but they haven't. You find that they appeared from soft southerners, I suppose they called them at the time, and they arrived in Scarborough by sea, presumably because they were fishermen, in about 1843-44, as near as, damn it. And going back through their ancestors, I've traced them back to 1730 now, still fishermen back in those days. If and when I ever find the next generation back, I'm hoping to trace them back to maybe the Spanish Armada. I always fancy finding one that fought against the Spanish Armada. I'm back to those, nearly to those dates, to be honest, but there is a gap because a lot of the records went missing during Cromwell's time. He, being a Puritan, he destroyed a lot of the church artifacts, you can call them, the fancy candle holders and all such as that. Didn't like the brasses in the churches, so a lot of those were ripped out, and at the same time a lot of the written records disappeared. So I have a gap of 80 years in my genealogy that I've got to sometime bridge. What else can I tell you? My time in the Merchant Navy, I went in at 16 as a deck boy, trained on an old clipper ship which was permanently tied up. It no longer went to sea, in Sharpness in Gloucestershire. and I spent 3 months there training as a deck boy, along with several hundred others, and then went to sea for the first time in 1954, August the 20th, 1954, a date I'll never forget. And joined a ship of the Royal Mail Line, and it's funny how you can remember the earlier ones, but the later ones they just blur. That particular one joined it in Middlesbrough. Very few signed on in Middlesbrough, they were all from the London area. She came here and was short of a couple of crew. And we, after calling at Newport, I think it was Newport or Swansea in South Wales, one of the two, we went out through to the West Indies, through the Panama Canal and up the west coast of the States. And it's a fantastic trip of 4 months. If you could imagine the feeling of going under the Golden Gate Bridge at the age of 16 into San Francisco, where we spent maybe a week or 10 days. Everything was loaded on ships by hand in those days. There were cranes, but no containers and nothing like that. So it was all handled. And the port of Los Angeles, which is actually San Pedro, is part of Los Angeles, but the port itself is San Pedro. And then further up the coast, as far as Seattle, Vancouver in Canada, New Westminster, which is a very tiny port where we loaded timber, or lumber as the Canadians call it, which was again loaded by hand. Each plank laid flat in the hold and another one fitted alongside, almost like laying a floor. No bundles of timber in those days, it was all laid one by one. And grain, and on the way back called all the same ports again, finish up with bales of cotton, and then back through the Panama Canal again and away home. But by then it was winter, and we were caught in a terrific storm coming across the Atlantic. Well, it chased us across the Atlantic, back end of a hurricane, and coming into we were heading for Liverpool, and we had to stop. We were hove to, as you call it. You know, you can't make headway against the seas, so you put the head into the wind, run the engines at a certain speed, and just keep ticking over until the storm dissipates. Several ships were sunk that weekend. From what I remember, there were 11 ships around the coasts of Europe sank. One within a couple of miles of us, and we spent a few days looking for survivors. We found a lot of debris. That particular ship, there were 23 drowned, and several picked up by 2 or 3 other ships, one of which I served on several years later, although at the time I didn't know I was going to, but she was there with us. And we eventually got into Liverpool, very badly damaged. The wheelhouse windows were smashed in. A lot of the derricks on the deck, which are cranes, but they're called derricks on ships, they were knocked out of the fittings, laid on the deck. The doors into the wheelhouse on one side were all stove in. In fact, that was one job I was given during the storm. Not allowed on deck, no one was, except for securing things. I was in the wheelhouse mopping it out. As a 16-year-old, that's all I was really able to do. And we spent several days in Liverpool, having repairs made and partial cargo discharged, and then ran to London and gone into dry dock for major repairs, and the whole crew paid off and we went home. Got home just in time for Christmas. And during that week coming around the coast, was when Scarborough lifeboat capsized, with the loss of 3 men. I think it was, yes, 3, one of which was a relative of mine, the coxswain. I didn't know it at the time because I wasn't into genealogy by then, but he turned out to be a second cousin coxswain. And the day after I got home was the big, enormous funeral with all the flat carts full of flowers through the town. Castle Road was closed down, Dean Road was closed, the whole town from St Mary's through to the cemetery at Dean Road was, everything was stopped, with thousands of people lining the roads. That was my first trip, and the skipper on that ship was making his last trip, and he said it was the worst weather he'd ever seen. I thought, good God, what am I let myself in for? But I never saw anything quite as bad again, must admit, although I've been through a few storms. And well, I served on a total of I think it was 14 ships in a matter of 10 years. Some people go and they spend 2 or 3 years on one ship, but I never stayed too long on any of them really. Apart from one, I was on one particular oil tanker, and we were supposed to go out from Middlesbrough out to the West Indies and Venezuela to load crude oil for home. And it was a beautiful ship, relatively new, single cabin for each man, which in those days was a bit of a rarity. You could get up to 4 men in a cabin on some ships, the older ones, but that was, so we said, this is great, we may do 2 trips in this, expecting a 6-week turnaround. And we got home a year and 5 days later. The journey was through out to Venezuela, loaded crude oil in a place called Cardon on the Maracaibo Lakes. But we took it to New Jersey and then went back for more. And that was up and down the Caribbean, the States, different places on the east coast of the States always, around New York and New Jersey. And then the odd trip down to South America, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, back to the Caribbean. And that went on for maybe 6 months. And we headed over to the Cape Verde Islands off the African coast. And the rumour was we were going home from there. But we took that cargo, no, we discharged cargo there, and we went up to Banias in Syria, through the Mediterranean. And that was supposed to be a cargo for home. And we thought it was true as we went through the English Channel, past the White Cliffs of Dover, and into Hamburg. And back out again for another 6 months. But it was a good trip.
And what were the jobs you were doing mostly on the ship?
My job, well, I didn't progress very far really. I was always a deckhand. I was a deck boy for about a year. The normal procedure is that the deck boy, or if there's more than one, takes turns being the mess boy, cleaning the accommodation and bringing the food from the galley for the crew. On the first trip, I chose, I think it was the wrong side of the coin it must have been, because we tossed a coin, there were 2 of us, both first trippers, and I chose for some reason doing the first half of the trip and then we'd swap over. But I had all the good weather inside and on the way home I was on deck in the cold weather. So I got the wrong half of the trip, to be honest. But it was a good experience. And after a while, you get promoted once you get experience to junior ordinary seaman. Then you become a senior ordinary seaman, maybe a few months or a year later. The next progression, you need to take training, further training, which is it's picked up on the ship, but you have to prove yourself to the Board of Trade examiners. So after a while, I took my EDH ticket, which is efficient deckhand. All they do is take you into a workshop. I did mine in Middlesbrough, and you spend 2 or 3 hours there answering questions, identifying things, do a bit of splicing and things like that. You have to prove that you've learned to steer a ship, handle the controls in the wheelhouse, which is always under supervision by an officer anyway. But he's often out of sight, so you're in the wheelhouse on your own, so you've got to be efficient. And usually when you're learning these things, as you're working your way from a deck boy, you go on the wheel during the evening usually, when you finish your ordinary work, and whoever's taking the turn at the wheel, a naval seaman, will teach you how to steer, how to box a compass, how to do anything like that. And at the end of it, the mate or the second mate, whoever's watch you're doing this work on, they'll give you a little certificate to say you've done a number of hours. It's called a steering ticket, just to prove you've handled the ship for so many hours. And you show that when you take any other further examinations later. The only one I didn't ever bother with, mainly because there was very little difference in pay, was to go to an able seaman rank from efficient deckhand. The only difference really is that an able seaman holds a lifeboat certificate, and you must have a certain number of men on every ship holding that certificate. The difference in pay was only about £2 a month, so I didn't bother with it. It meant you had to stay ashore for a certain length of time and do your training in the docks on a lifeboat, so it didn't really fit into my plans.
Was that how to launch the lifeboats? Or?
Oh yes, you have to do all that. In fact, I did this at training school as a boy, but of course you couldn't have done that. You couldn't have taken charge of anything. We had an adult officer and maybe 10 boys doing this on the training ship. Normally on a ship, it depends. But a lot of the older ships I was on had the old, very old methods of launching lifeboats, which they were called radial davits. They were the old ones that you actually see in old films. They're just a curved metal loop which are in a socket in the deck. There are 2 of them, and it's a funny method. You've got to swing the lifeboat forward, push the stern of it out, which turns one of the davits round, so it's outboard instead of inboard as it was originally. That goes back, the front one swivels round, and then you push it forward. You do like a shuffle with it until it's hanging outboard, and then it's all lowered on ropes. Whereas the later ones, I don't know what they do nowadays, Matt, because it's a long time ago. The later ones were all run on a brake system, an electric motor to bring it back up. But for emergency use, all you would do was to undo a couple of ropes which were on quick release clips. They usually had 2 big pins safety ones so that it couldn't go down by accident. They were removed. The brake released on a brake drum, and it swung out with the weight of the boat, swung it out and lowered it down to the water.
But presumably you never had to abandon ship, did you?
No, but we did 2 or 3 times during that 10-year period lower a boat down into the water. In fact, to be honest, I was forgetting this one. I spent 8 months on one ship, travelling on the Canadian coast, the east coast, from Montreal and Quebec, carrying supplies for all the small ports up in the Hudson Bay and Newfoundland, all that area. It's only open for 3 or 4 months during the summer, and then it's iced up again. And we actually had to go. We went to one port, and we'd previously loaded a big steel barge on the deck of the ship. It overhung the sides of the ship, either side, by at least 15 feet. And we took that up into the Hudson Bay. Well, it's an offshoot from the Hudson Bay called Ungava Bay, quite still a big area. And we had to launch it over the side, lash everything down because the ship rocked like hell. And then we lowered our motor lifeboat, which you've usually got one with an engine. And we towed the barge, we loaded the barge ourselves. There was no one else there. There was actually one person who came to guide us in. He arrived in a canoe, and I'm not sure if he was an Eskimo or an Indian, but they merged into one at those latitudes. It could have been either. Yeah. And we towed the barge in after loading it and tied it up to a pier, and we never saw another soul. Presumably the last ship going back to Quebec would take the barge back.
So this sort of rumour of a girl in every port, that's not true then? If
There was no one in that port. The other main port in that area is, there's Churchill, which everyone's heard of. We went to a place called Southampton Island. It's an island right in the middle of Hudson Bay. Southampton Island. I'm trying to think of the name of the port on the island. And there were true Eskimos or Inuits who worked the cargo from us. They were dressed just like you see in the films, with the sealskin boots, the fur leggings, the what did we call the coats? They were like anoraks, but they weren't called anoraks. Mackinaws, I think they were, Mackinaws, yeah. And they were true Eskimos. Worked all the cargo.
Did you get much time on the land when you were in ports? Did you get time to see the countries you visited?
My first trip in particular, there was one of the crew on there who he'd joined the ship to see the world. He hadn't really gone through the system to become a seaman permanently. Mm-hmm. He'd taken a job on deck, unqualified, and all he wanted to do was, every time he got into port, he wanted to go ashore and see things. And I tagged along with him for some of the time. And when we were in San Francisco, we went ashore there, all through Chinatown, saw the Telegraph Hill, which is always shown in films. We passed Alcatraz, but we were a long way off it. It's in the middle of the bay as you go. And I remember one run ashore, I went with him. He'd planned to go, this was in Vancouver, which is a big city. He got leaflets, in every port he got leaflets, and he said, we're going to Capilano Canyon. I said, where's that? He said, it's a few miles out of town, we go on a bus tour. And we got the day off, because we were in there for at least a week, loading cases of salmon of all things, which were all done by hand, and it was a slow job. We didn't do any loading, the shore people did that. We just prepare the ship for loading. and we went up to through, I think it was Elizabeth Park or some name like that. It was an English sounding name. It'll come to me in a minute. A big park where there were totem poles on display for tourists. This was, and we went on the bus trip, way through the city, out the other side, across. I remember crossing a big bridge on the bus and then up into the mountains. And Capilano Canyon is exactly as it sounds. It's a deep chasm with a suspension bridge across, footbridge, suspension bridge, which seemed to swing as you went across it, and the height was...
So generally, in kind of balance of how much time you spent at sea, say, as you say, if you were at sea for a month, would you then get a certain amount of shore leave?
It depends on you didn't get shore leave as such. You got time off at the end of the day. If you were on a tanker, tankers only spent a maximum of 12 hours in port. It was all pumped aboard. And all we really had to do as the crew were maintenance work. The preparation for loading the oil was done by a specialist member of the crew, and him and the mate usually, they worked all the valves to fill various tanks, which had to be done gradually. You couldn't fill one row of tanks first, otherwise you'll cockle over a little bit. And it was all done evenly by opening and closing valves and venting the gases out, which was a big safety feature on a tanker. No naked lights or anything, sparks.
No smoking.
No, and all metal objects were either copper or brass, not to cause sparks. And yeah, so you could probably get half the crew allowed shore leave during the day. Always had to have at least 6 on standby. In the evening was a different thing. They'd ask for a volunteer usually, or maybe 2, to become night watchmen, and they stayed up overnight, 12 hours, while everybody else went ashore. If you happen to be in overnight on the tanker. Now a cargo ship's a different thing altogether, especially in those days when there were no containers. It was a long drawn out job, and the hatches were, the hatchways were quite large. I can't tell you the measurements, they did vary, but they were very big. And they had steel beams which slotted into sockets at either side, and this divided the opening into maybe sections, I would say maybe 6 to 10 feet each section. So there'd be a steel beam every 6 to 10 feet. And then there were wooden hatch covers put on that. And then tarpaulins. If you were going into the Atlantic or anywhere well away from land, you'd have 3 layers of tarpaulins over, all battened down and tight and wedged, and they had steel bars locking the edges.
Because you get sort of 40-foot high waves, don't you? In the
Oh
Atlantic?
yes, yeah.
Does that make you seasick? Did you ever get seasick? Or?
Yeah, I was seasick on the first trip. In fact, it was a bit, again, sick in a way. We went round from Middlesbrough to, I think it was Newport we went to in South Wales to finish off the cargo, and the 2 deck boys were sat in the mess room. It was in the evening, and we only worked during the day, whereas others worked, well, it was shift work, you had set watches, but we were off duty, and there were a couple of the ABs watching us, and was saying, "What's wrong? What are you waiting for?" I said, "I'm waiting for you to be sick." And sure enough, I was.
Yeah.
As we went round, that was just around the English Channel, you know, down the North Sea and around there, which wasn't very, oh, how can you say, wasn't very rough. But once we got out into the Atlantic, although it wasn't a rough sea, it was just a very long, slow swell. You know, maybe no waves really, just a swell, very very smooth. But you were up and down 6 to 10 feet, up and down, and I was sick as a dog all the way across the Atlantic, 10 days.
Wow.
I thought it was the end of the world. And I was never sick again after that. I felt slightly queasy the odd time. First day out, after being home for a few weeks, and even some of the ABs were like that. But after 24 hours out, you thought nothing of it at all. But that first trip, it was murder. I didn't eat or hardly drank for, as I say, 10 days until we got to the Caribbean. And then it was probably the excitement of getting there that...
So you could actually become quite ill if you're not eating or drinking
for
10 days. You could actually physically become very ill.
I had to eat, but it never lasted long.
It's a sort of balance thing, isn't it, in your ears?
It is, yeah. But I still had my work to do.
Right, wow.
You know, if you're cleaning the mess room out or all like that, you had one bucket for cleaning and one for being sick.
Yeah. So I think at the library you told me some things about tunny fishing as well, because you said that you were interested in the tunny fishing.
I can remember it as a child, really. After we returned from Sheffield, you know, after 1 year there during the war, we came back and there was housing shortage. We had nowhere to live. And my mother's sister, my aunt, she had a rented house on Key Street, and it was almost the oldest house in Scarborough. It's no longer there. I don't know why it was ever pulled down. She lived in my aunt's house. It was really. She lived there just with herself and her son, and we moved in with her. I don't know how we managed, because we were originally a family of nine children. One was already away in Canada by then. My second eldest brother, he was at sea fishing then. He later became a merchant seaman, but he was fishing at the time out of Grimsby. And the rest of us moved in until we could get a house of our own. And that was 25 Key Street, which was known as Crazy Cottage, a timber-framed house, there are hundreds of photographs of it around Scarborough.
There's not that many rooms in it though, are there, for 9?
No, as far as I remember, there were only, let me see, there'd been 3, there'd have been 5 bedrooms. The downstairs rooms were very small, a kitchen and a scullery kind of thing, and a cellar below that, which was enormous. The whole area of the house was the cellar. No, we all managed to get in somehow.
I mean, people shared beds then anyway, didn't they? I mean,
well, as kids we did,
yeah.
Oh yeah, it was like sardines in bed. 3 at the top and 3 at the bottom kind of thing, you know, at times. And no bathroom, of course.
Oh,
there was an outside toilet, but no bathroom at all. I can remember as a kid being bathed in what we called a peggy tub, or a dolly tub, some people call them, which was a washing tub. The round ones, they're like a barrel made out of zinc.
Right.
Like the old tin baths, but this was for washing really. And as kids we used to get bathed in that. You know, the last one, I think he came out dirtier than he went in.
Did they just heat the water up on the fire then? You had like a kettle and...
Kettles, and just keep adding it and then cold water to top it up. And I think that's where the saying comes from, don't throw the baby out with a dishwater or whatever it was. I think it was so dirty you couldn't find the last one.
And I mean, the soap then would have been what, carbolic soap or something?
It was
pretty
blocks
awful,
of soap.
was it? Yeah.
You know, the shops got it in long bars and you cut off a slab of it. In fact, we used that at sea.
Right.
You know, the old blocks, hard, very hard soap.
Mm. It must have been cold as well in the winter, I would imagine. I suppose you all snuggled in together, but no heating, no central heating.
Oh no, no central heating.
Yeah.
I can't remember ever being cold.
Right.
No.
Wow. But you played a lot around the harbour then, because it's right close to the
Oh
harbour.
yes, well, my aunt, she was lame. She'd been lame from being a child. I think she'd injured her legs, and she shuffled when she walked, and she earned her living by skinning mussels for the fishermen. They'd bring along maybe 6 bags of mussels, you know, the big sacks, and she'd sit there in the yard in summer on a stool with an open bag, skinning the mussels, and her hands, they were flying, you know, a mussel a second kind of thing, you know. Just one movement with a knife, a rounded-ended knife. There were no sharp-ended knives used for such as that. And she could skin 2 or 3 bags of mussels in a day easily. And they'd bring they were long-line fishermen then, on the smaller boats anyway. And she'd bait the hooks as well, but the lines were prepared on like, I don't know what they call them. They were a flat woven pallet, and they were coiled on there with all the hooks hanging one side, ready for sending over the boat. So all the hooks were laid together, and she'd bait all the lines up as well. Our job, myself and her son, who was my cousin, he was about a year older than me, we could earn a few coppers by taking the sacks of mussel shells, you know, all the shells were put back in the bags. We'd take them on a barrow, round the marine drive and tip them over the side. They all went through the railings on the edge of the marine drive. I think we got 6pence a load for doing that, which was quite good really. Yeah. And we'd... Oh, another method of earning a few coppers as kids, the herring were in great supply during the summer months, late summer mainly, and we'd go around the harbour, and when they're unloading herring, it was all done in wicker baskets, which was filled on a couple of hooks and swung ashore, and every so often it would bump something and 2 or 3 herrings would slide out, and we'd dash in, grab the herrings and back off to the side again until we had enough to set up a little stall, and we sold them. Yeah. 6 for a penny or something like that. Never made a fortune, but it was pocket money. We'd go around the other side of the fish market where all the empty boxes were stacked up, and make a little bench out of fish boxes, and the visitors coming by would just sell them the herrings. We'd clean them first, and I don't think half of them knew how to cook herrings, to be honest. They bought them just to give us the money. Yeah.
Why did you not want to go into fishing then? Or did that kind of put you off? Or?
Well, my second eldest brother, he was into fishing, and he gave me some very bad stories about it. And I don't remember my father hardly at all, so I didn't get any information from him about fishing. But around the harbour, it was always shown as being a very hard life, which I believe it was. And it wasn't really for me. And I'd been told so many stories about foreign ports and the big ships, that's what I wanted to do. You know, so my brother was the last one in a long line of our family to go fishing, and there won't be any more in our family, but Every other generation were fishermen. In fact, there was a fairly famous Captain Smith who died a few years ago. He told me, I met him once and I was trying to find stories about the Allen family, because I didn't know much at all. And he said, oh yes, the Allens, they owned the trio. He knew everything off the top of his head. So, well, what was the trio? And it was well then, what type of ship was it? It was a big sailing boat, fishing, that is. Carried a crew of 5 or 6, so they were fairly big things. And he ran that for 60 years. It was 60 years old when he sold it. It was sold when he died. It was in his will, Robert Allen. A lot of Robert Allens through the family there. None in our immediate one. It was in his will that the boat and the gear would be sold and shared among his 4 sons. So it had to be sold. Unfortunately, a year, maybe 2 years later, it went down with all hands. Okay. With a Farley crew aboard. 5 Farley men were lost on that boat. But it was no boat by then. It was 60 years old, as I say. That's the only boat I've ever traced that belonged to the Allens, but there were probably others earlier.
So did you eat a lot of fish when you were growing up then?
Oh yes, yeah.
Fish every day?
Just about,
really?
Yeah.
Was it herring or cod and a bit of everything?
Herring was always pickled. My mother did it in big jars. She'd roll the herrings, clean them, split them, scrape the scales off. Very scaly fish, herring. And roll them. They used to stick. They were like cocktail sticks. They used to keep them rolled, and then they were put in a jar of, like you do pickled eggs nowadays and onions, but these were herrings in big jars of vinegar, and they lasted right through the winter.
And did you just eat them raw then, or you cook them raw?
I'm not 100% sure. I think they were just pickled raw. You can still get them, but I've tried them since and I thought, oh, I remember those as a kid, we'll get some. And they were horrible. Your taste changed totally.
But you ate other fish, I mean your father
caught
other fish. And
cod, yeah.
Yeah.
The fishermen always used to take 1 or 2 fish home with them after landing them and putting them on the market. You know, each member of the crew would take a fish home, and it was usually a pretty good sized cod. And I used to see them as kids coming off the harbour, still wearing their long waders and their oilskins and, you know, all the typical fisherman gear, walking home carrying a couple of fish on the fingers hooked to carry them all the way up the main street or wherever they lived.
So was it your oldest brother then that kind of looked after the family then, was it? Did he?
When my father was killed, that was 1944, July the 5th, 44, 1 month after D-Day. My eldest brother by then was at sea. He started, this is deep sea, you know, he never went fishing that I know of. He was on Norwegian ships initially. He went when he was about 17. I think he ran away. And he finished up on British ships during the war on the Atlantic convoys. In fact, he was torpedoed. They were leaving Halifax on the way home on one trip, and coming out of Halifax, several ships were torpedoed, his among them, but they weren't sunk. They were taken back in, badly damaged, and he was in hospital for a while, and the war ended while he was there. So this was 45, it must have been. And in those days, I don't know if it was a general thing, but seamen, or maybe soldiers as well, were allowed to take up the nationality of the country they were in when the war ended. Mm. He came home for a very short period before that, and then he went back to Canada, and he never came home again. Mm. He joined the Canadian Royal Navy for a while. All he ever did in that was to play football. He was in the Navy team. Then he became a merchant seaman in Canada. From that he became one of the main union leaders in Nova Scotia. And he finished up when he was in his 40s running a restaurant. He died quite young, he was only 50. Died of a heart attack. So he never came back, but they planned to come back the year he died. They planned the holiday, himself and his wife and 2 or 3 of the kids. I think they had 4 or 5 children. And he died, so they put the holiday back, and his wife came with the kids the year after to see us. The first time she came, that was. She's been back twice since.
Are they all your other brothers spread about over the world then, or are they?
No, there were three boys and 6 girls in the family. Right. So the middle one, Ken, he was in the Merchant Navy. Well, he was fishing originally, out of Hull and Grimsby. And then he joined the Merchant Navy. Not long before I did. He was in the engine room, wasn't a deckman. When I left because I got married, and I was about a year in doing bits and pieces, really looking for a decent job, and then I joined British Telecom, and I spent 30 odd years with them. And Ken joined me in the same job for a while, but he didn't like it. He didn't like the sort of discipline of a government job. So he went back to sea. He died at 60. And at that time I said, right, I'm going to retire as soon as possible and get a few years, because one brother died at 50, one at 60, and when I was 54 they were making a lot of men redundant. I wasn't one of them, but I volunteered for it, and I retired at 54. And I've had quite a few good years since then, with a good pension. It hasn't gone up much since I left, because it doesn't go up in time with other things, but I'm quite happy with that. And my sisters, one lives in New Zealand. She's been there quite a few years. She emigrated at 18 by herself. Wow. Met a future husband on the immigrant ship. Married, had 2 daughters and a son. And they came back to England, where they parted company. And a friend of hers who'd emigrated about the same time as her originally, who she'd never seen all the years since, happened to come back to Scarborough on holiday, and his wife had just died, and they met up and married and went back to New Zealand, and they're still living there now, South Island, New Zealand. So finished up being 2 Scarborough people married and living in New Zealand. He was from a fishing family. In fact, he was fishing out of New Zealand until his. I don't know if he went till his retirement, because he worked on the docks in Timaru up to retirement. But prior to that, he was a fisherman out of New Zealand.
Because there were never any, the girls would have never been allowed to be fishermen or involved in fishing. There were no women on boats.
Although one of my sisters, the one who was just older than me, she, I don't know if she fancied going to sea. I think she did. She joined they don't have them now. There are boys and girls are sea cadets nowadays. Well, in those days they weren't. I was the sea cadet for several years, but it was boys only. But there was a group, they were called Sea Rangers, with the girls, and she was one of those, wandering about town showing off in a navy uniform, and so was I then. But she never went to sea or anything like that. She moved with her husband up to Middlesbrough. He worked at ICI most of his life, and they're back in Scarborough now, retired.
Do you think the community's changed a lot in Scarborough then? Because as you say, people move away.
It has really. I lost touch with a lot of my friends. I mean, I was born in Cross Street, just up from the market. Those houses and flats at that time were pretty new. So I reckon they were probably built in the late 1930s. I was born in 38, and I was born in that house. So was my younger sister. And I knew everyone down there. And then when we lived for a while on Quay Street itself, I knew everyone. But then when I went to sea, my mother by then lived just off Northway, where the clinic is now. There was a row of terrace houses there, Unicorn Place. We lived there for a lot of years. And you lose touch with the ones at the bottom end, especially with going away at sea as well. You'd come home and you'd have a few friends, but the old friends disappeared. And I was always of the opinion that, now then, how can I put this? You'd see someone and you think, I'm sure I know him, but you're frightened to say in case they don't know you. You always had that feeling, and maybe they recognised you and felt the same, so you'd never get together again somehow, you know.
But the old town has changed. A lot of people have said to me that, you know, that they knew everybody, and it has changed a lot now, so that community's gone.
Yeah, it's certain times of the year it was very quiet at the bottom end. In the fishing, you know, herring season, it was mad, mostly around the harbour, but not with the visitors as it got later, you know, in the 60s, 70s and into the 80s. There were thousands of visitors down there, more than there are now, much more. But prior to that it was mostly locals and fishermen from other towns, because they followed herring around, so you'd get all the Scottish boats coming in. At times you couldn't understand what anyone was saying with the various accents.
Was there any trouble? Were there fights between the Scots and the...
I've heard about them.
Yeah.
I've never really witnessed much. But that's always gone on as far as I know. If you look at historically, I'm trying to think of the nickname they had for them. My ancestors, when they arrived, there was trouble between the Scarborough fishermen and them. Because they probably did the same as the Scottish fishermen in later years. They came following the fish. And some of them decided, this is a nice place, I'll stay here for a while. And some stayed permanently, and others moved on again. But you find that, I would say, possibly 2/3 of the bottom enders in Scarborough their ancestors originate from Suffolk, Norfolk, and even further south. And mine did. And they used to have lots of fights and what have you. I can't think of the nickname they had for the Suffolk people. They had a nickname, and it was probably to do with the accent. That's the thing I found with doing family history. You start out tracing your family, and I was a bit naive. You look for spellings of your name exactly as your name is normally spelled, A-L-L-E-N for Alan. And I wasted the first 6 months of it because I then realised that they couldn't read or write. And the name was spelt according to the way they pronounced it to the one or two people within the church and record offices, etc., who could write. So they spelt it as it was.
A-L-A-N.
Yeah. And you find that it varied. On one record it'll be EN, another record, the same family, would be AN, but they didn't know because they couldn't read what the vicar had written down. And you find that the Scottish Allans are almost all AN because of the accent. Around this area they're almost all EN with a sprinkling of ANs, and I've only ever found one YN, and he was probably an incomer. You go down to Suffolk and there's no ANs at all, unless it's a Scotsman who settled there. But they start changing to IN and YN because they pronounce, I say Alan, they say Alin in the Suffolk accent. So it got written down with an I instead of an E.
Wow, that makes it hard to trace, doesn't it?
Yeah. My furthest ancestors are INs, A-L-L-I-N, but it's only because they pronounce it that way.
Yeah, I remember at the library you were quite interested in the tunny fishing thing. Was there any? Did you have a particular interest in that as well? Or?
Yeah, we used to watch them bringing them in. Although at the time I thought it was a normal sort of catch, because as kids we didn't have any sort of earlier experience. We were maybe 5, 6, 7 years of age, up to maybe 10 when we were down there. And when we saw a boat bringing in and putting 3 or 4 tunny up on the gantry, sticking labels on showing what weight they were and getting the photographs taken, usually with the rich man in the middle with his fishing rod and his +4s, etc. We thought that was about normal to see one load coming in every odd week or something like that. Apparently it was almost dead by then, the tunny fishing.
Yeah, because 30s were the peak.
It'd been the 30s, but we had no experience of that, so we didn't know about it. I know now through reading about it. And so we saw that quite often, it seemed, but it was probably only for a couple of months in summer. And then they had a big green hut near the jetty, where that pizza place is now.
Oh yeah, Ask.
Yeah, well, that was the toilet block and benches for people to sit, you know, prior to that being built. And there was an open area at the end of that, the opposite end to where the police box used to be. And they used to put up a big green, like a shed there, and put at least 1 tunny on display. And it was on ice. It was probably starting to smell a little bit, really, but the ice kept it away. And people used to pay maybe 6pence to go in and see the tunny. And they put a few other fish there just to make it a little more interesting. And I remember that being there every summer for several years. And of course the Tunny Club, which I don't know what it is now.
East Soundgate, isn't it?
Yeah, that was still the Tunny Club for members of the tunny fishing. In fact, one of my ancestors was a boatman for the tunny fishing, Bob Allen. But again, there were several Bob Allens.
Yeah. Wow.
And if he's a nuisance, I'll take him out again.
Yeah. And just moving forward then to your BT days, did you did all the kind of telephone lines in Scarborough? Did you?
Yeah, I started off. I picked a bad time to start It was the winter of '62, which was a very bad winter. I started in November, and by Christmas, or maybe it was New Year, I'm not quite sure, it was there was 6 foot of snow in the countryside, and you couldn't work. I started in a gang, an overhead work gang, and my first job for several weeks was picking up broken wires,
Yeah.
which had come down through. It was ice that brought them down. The ice on the wires was the size of a milk bottle. You know, it built up, and the wires sagged and sagged, and eventually snapped. And in the spring of that following year, I then was asked if I wanted to become a cable jointer. And I said yes. Anything to get out of the gang. And so I became a jointer's mate for about a year, taking several courses. I finished up doing, I think it must have been 20 odd training courses over the years. And I finished up being a foreman cable jointer, working mainly in my last couple of years on the new network, which was fibre optic cables. That was a really interesting job. It was all done under a microscope in the back of a van. The cables were brought into the back and set up ready for jointing, and the fiberglass it had to be cut perfectly straight, square-ended, and then you set it up.
What sort of year was that then, fibre optics came in?
Oh, a bit difficult to remember really.